As you mentioned, we're going to go through some of the information that I provided verbally in response to a question at last week's board meeting, providing a lot of graphs and data as a response to the resolution that was approved by the board in June. Also, as part of that resolution, there was a request for an equity analysis looking at year-over-year changes from this school year into next school year, the total budget allocations by semi-quintile. So first, the expenditure data that we're showing is going back in time, and the last full fiscal year where we have final expenditure figures are last school year, the 24-25 school year. And as you know, the audit was already presented to the board back in January, so those are our final figures. But we also are going to include some information for this year and next year that are our budget figures. So expenditure figures from last year and earlier, but then for this year and moving forward, what we have are our budget expenditures. And so the source of data is those general fund and audited actuals, including general fund, all general funds, so both restricted and unrestricted. And when we refer to non-labor expenditures, it's probably self-evident, but it refers to anything that's not a personnel-related expense. So personnel-related expenses are, of course, salaries and benefits. And the benefits include not just the common ones that we think of like health benefits, but they also include the contributions that we make on behalf of our employees for pension and Medicare, taxes, et cetera. And so those are all the things that we consider labor. Everything else is non-labor, and that includes what are called books and supplies. In our budget book, we report information, not just in our budget book, but in the first interim report and the second interim report. Basically, all of our financial reports are reported based on the requirements of the state. And so the big category of books and supplies is a category that includes, of course, books and supplies themselves, but it also includes instructional materials, really kind of physical things that schools, primarily schools, need. That would also include things like custodial supplies. The next big category of non-labor are other operating expenditures, and within that, we have the professional services contracts or consulting contracts. And we're also going to look at the other category, which is capitalized equipment. So those are certain technology purchases are the best example. All right, so this is something that we've shown previously several times, and it just shows the overall district budget and how it's organized. And again, this is also governed by law. These are the different kind of funds and categories of spending and budgets that we're required to report on. So we focus very heavily typically on not just our operating funds, but within the operating funds, the biggest fund is the general fund. And the general fund is broken out into unrestricted and restricted. The restricted general fund is, as I mentioned last week, those are determined by law. We don't decide what's restricted or unrestricted. And so that's why you see those highlighted in yellow, because that's what we're going to be primarily focusing on today. So first is the share of our total general fund spending or expenditures that were on labor and non-labor all the way back from the 2014-15 school year through last school year, through the 24-25 school year. So you'll see before the pandemic, so basically all the way from 14-15 through the first year of the pandemic, the 19-20 school year, the percentage of the total spending in the general fund, and this is both unrestricted and restricted, the share of spending that went to non-labor, those non-labor categories that I just described, was about 16 to 17% of total expenditures. And then you'll see in the second year, the second school year of the pandemic, but the real first year of substantial pandemic-related spending, the 2021 school year, the share of the spending in the general fund went up to 22%. The following year, 21-22, to 24%, and that was really the peak year of the non-labor spending. And it's for the reasons that you can imagine. There was a substantial amount of spending on non-labor services. A really big example of that during the pandemic was COVID testing. So the district undertook very expansive COVID testing in order to safely reopen schools, to safely continue to operate our schools. So that's the biggest example of the COVID-related spending in non-labor that contributed to that substantial percentage in 21-22. And then since that peak year, you'll see that slowly the percentage of the district's general fund expenditures that was for non-labor started going back towards the pre-pandemic share. So 22-23, 23-24 were both at 21%, and then last school year at 20%. And this is, I think, if you looked at most school districts, you would likely see a very similar trend, a substantial increase in the share due to the pandemic, and a slow revision back towards the pre-pandemic trend. Here is looking specifically at the category of books and supplies. But remember, the books and supplies includes more than just books and supplies. It's a pretty broad category, and it's those physical things that school districts purchase. And so you'll see here the orange is the portion of these books and supplies expenditures that are general fund unrestricted. The green is other restricted. The blue is COVID funds, and then the purple is ELOP. So those last three, the other restricted, the COVID funds, and ELOP funds, those are all general fund restricted. But we thought it was very meaningful to split out the COVID funds so you could see how much of this spending in books and supplies is attributable to specifically COVID-related funds. And then ELOP is important also because it's a relatively new program. It's a program that the annual revenues we receive are about $470 million. And while it's spent on a lot of labor expenses to expand after-school programming and other opportunities for our students, there are portions of it that are spent on non-labor. And so you'll see the trends there, even just the orange, the general fund unrestricted, we did see, even before the pandemic, a steady increase in the dollar amount spent on books and supplies. And then you'll see, obviously, it went up as most other things did in the pandemic, and then is now kind of reverting back to pre-pandemic levels. But when you look at the very top line, the grand total, those numbers hovering above those stacked bars, you'll see that the total spend in all of general fund is still, of course, peaked during the pandemic, but is still quite a bit higher than even the pre-pandemic levels. And largely it is because of substantial spending in new restricted programs that did not exist previously. And that's that purple that you see for ELOP. Next, we're going to zoom into what are traditionally considered contracts. These are professional and consulting services. This also goes from 14-15 through today. And you're going to see a very similar trend as you saw in books and supplies. So the colors here for the stacked bar graph are the same as on the previous slide. Orange, general fund unrestricted. Everything else is restricted, but you'll see that, again, the COVID funds and the ELOP funds are called out. And you'll see a very similar trend as we did, not just in overall non-labor, not just in books and supplies. So what you'll see is a substantial increase in overall spend, especially in the 21-22 school year, nearly $1 billion spent. The large amount that you see there in the orange general fund unrestricted is related to that COVID testing that I mentioned. You'll remember that we did receive a substantial reimbursement from FEMA to cover those costs that were incurred against the general fund unrestricted. But you'll also see a substantial use of COVID funds in the blue, as well as upon the inception of ELOP, the first year of expenditures for ELOP being in 22-23, you'll see substantial sums spent there, which is to be expected. ELOP funds, again, are for enrichment opportunities for our students, principally after school, but also intersession programming. And the biggest example of contract spending within ELOP is, of course, our high dosage tutoring. So again, like you see in other trends, we do see an increase overall, even before the pandemic, a substantial spike in the pandemic years, and then a reversion back towards more closely to the pre-pandemic levels, but still higher overall, again, because ELOP is new. It did not exist before. We didn't have any expenditures before the 22-23 school year. Other restricted, the biggest examples of other restricted are going to be our spending within special education. And this is a nationwide trend that we're seeing higher levels of spending for our students with disabilities. Okay, so when we look at the last school year and we look at the non-labor expenditures, it was just under $1 billion at about $954 million. Of the total non-labor spend last year of the $2.3 billion, about almost $1 billion was at the school sites. Okay, so this is all non-labor. This is books and supplies. This is other operating expenditures. This also includes non-capitalized equipment. About $1 billion was at our school sites. About $778 million was within the central office or centrally administered programs that are other non-labor expenditures, and a substantial sum, over $500 million, were also kind of centrally administered, but that we consider unavoidable costs. Unavoidable cost is not an official term. That's not a term you'll find in the California School Accounting Manual, but it represents the types of spending that really are essential and really typically cannot be avoided. And I'll provide some examples of that in a moment, but it includes things like utilities, waste management, and similar type expenditures that really are going to happen every year. So here's a breakdown of that over $500 million. There are, of course, special education services. There are mandated textbooks, utilities, the rubbish pickup, legal settlements, and then importantly, insurance premiums. The insurance premiums, these are not premiums for health benefits. Health benefit costs show up as a labor expense. So when you look at our budgets, you look at our financial reports, health benefit costs show up under that category of employee benefits, which is a labor cost. These insurance premiums are related to basically every other type of insurance that the district has. Liability coverage, property insurance, there are numerous cybersecurity insurance, there are numerous types of insurance that districts have to protect against risk. And that's the concept of the necessity for insurance, is to protect against certain kinds of risks. And so that is a very huge part of what the district's non-labor spending is for. It's for that kind of coverage to protect the district against substantial risks. So we also want to look at the other professional services, what are traditionally considered to be contracts, consulting contracts, services on contracts. And so what you see here are spending last school year within certain categories of professional services contracts, where the spending with vendors exceeded $5 million. So these are kind of the major vendors. And so there are a very substantial number of approved contracts and vendors. For a district our size, we do have several different vendors, some that are summarized here where our expenditures exceed $5 million, but also some where the expenditure levels are much smaller. The district is continuing to do a deep dive on even the smaller contracts so that we can provide that information both to the board and the public. But here you do see a good snapshot of some of the things that are where we spend money with some of our vendors. So the first is, not surprisingly, school transportation. There's tutoring and after-school programs, IT infrastructure, equipment like computers and devices, digital tools, election costs, printed materials. And so these are some of the major categories where we're seeing substantial amount of spending on professional services contracts. Now we're looking here at general fund, restricted and unrestricted spending and operating budgets. And so here you'll see where we do include future years, right? We have this year and next year where we don't yet have final expenditure numbers. And you'll see in the orange, that is kind of the central office or centrally administered spending. Now, of course, all of that spending is on behalf of students. So a good example is tutoring. Even though tutoring shows up as a central expenditure, a centrally administered program, it's of course students that are receiving the direct supports from those services. And then in the blue, you'll see the school site portion of these other operating expenses. So you'll see a trend that's kind of, substantial increases through the pandemic years and then a revision starting thereafter. And that's true not just for the central office, but also for schools. And for schools, we see a very similar trend where, during the pandemic years with a substantial influx of funds that were allocated to schools during that time period, this is what we would expect to see. And then now when we're moving forward into a time period of much more limited resources, we see that the spending in the past and then budgets moving forward are, of course, lower. This is the numbers behind what you saw on that table. And I think I want to highlight on the far right-hand side the percentages of the total budget that these figures represent. So there's a lot of numbers. There are a lot of numbers on this slide. The rows are fiscal years. The first set of columns are school sites organized by unrestricted and restricted, and then the subtotal for school sites. Same for central office or centrally administered services. Unrestricted and restricted, then the subtotal for those. Then the grand total in that dark gray. And then a column for what the total general fund budget was in each of those years, and then the corresponding percentage of that total. And so you'll see kind of in the 17-18 school year and fiscal year 2018, this represented about 12% of the budget, substantially increased through that high point of the 21-22 school year to 16%. And now we're seeing things regress back towards the pre-pandemic norm. So for the current school year, the 25-26 school year, about 12% of total budget. And next school year, as at this point in time, right? This point in time, next year's budget is 11%. When we zoom in specifically to the professional and consulting services, very much the same trend. Again, orange is those centrally administered and central office contracts. In blue, you'll see school site, and these are the budgets. And you'll see a very, very similar trend. So not just at the school levels, but at those central programs and centrally administered services, a substantial increase through the pandemic years, and then a reversion back to pre-pandemic levels moving forward. Here are all of the details behind that graph that I just showed you. Again, the same columns, the school, unrestricted and restricted, the central office, unrestricted and restricted, the grand total, and then the percentage of the budget that these represent. So pre-pandemic was around 4%, high point about 9% in the 21-22 school year, and at least at this point in time for next school year, about 2% of the general fund budget for these professional and consulting services contracts. So this is kind of consistent with some information we provided last week when we talked about how both schools and central offices really prioritized, to the extent that they could with the limited resources provided, prioritized positions, the valued employees that provide the vast majority of the services to our students and families. And what that meant was that other budgets, non-labor budgets, were needed to be reduced substantially in order to maintain as much of the personnel levels as possible. And so this is consistent with what we had shared with the board last week. So obviously there are many things that influence and impact the level of spending on non-labor. There are, of course, discretionary funds that schools are allocated, and they have the discretion to either use them for instructional materials, books and supplies, contracted services, or instead to use them for positions. But also at the district level, there are policy decisions that get made that impact the amount of spending that happens in non-labor. And these are just some examples, and these are some examples that even came up in discussions at last week's board meeting. So the first is tutoring. Of course, there's a substantial emphasis on tutoring to support our students and their learning. There's one-to-one devices for students. There are digital tools that help our student learning as well. There are transportation costs. And there's also real estate utilization. And what we mean by that is right now there are substantial schools with in terms of the space utilization that might be relatively low. And there's a cost associated with that. And some of that cost is borne by non-labor. The most obvious example of a non-labor expenditure for a facility that might be quote unquote underutilized is utilities. But there's also maintenance costs associated with those utilities as well, and so that's why we're highlighting it here. Also, we're always trying to be as creative as possible when we're contracting for services. So we always want to get the best price, we always want to get the best value. There are competitive processes that ensure that we are getting a good price and a good value. But there are sometimes even opportunities for revenue sharing models. So opportunities within contracting to offset the amount of spend that we have in non-labor expenditures. And that's especially true. There's some examples of that in some of our IT business applications, where if we get creative in the way we contract, because so much time and resources are put in to developing tools for LAUSD, given our size, and sometimes the development of those tools, the final product, is something that can be used by other districts, and that presents an opportunity for us to generate revenue that can offset the amount that we spend on those contracts. So that is a quick overview again of kind of historical trends and how, again, in summary, that like many districts, we saw a substantial increase in overall budgets and then the share of those budgets that were spent on non-labor. And then since the peak of the pandemic years, a reversion back to closer to pre-pandemic levels. And that's true not only when we look at the expenditures, but it's especially true when we look at budgets for this year and next school year. Next, I want to provide a summary of year-over-year changes in school budget allocations. So first, we are looking at the change in total budget allocations, looking at this year compared to next year. This does exclude school carryover as well as school donations, but it otherwise includes basically every allocation that schools receive in the general fund. So what you won't see here also are bond-funded expenditures, capital expenditures that vary quite a bit depending on where projects are happening in any given fiscal year. So what you see on the table, and I'll go through it in some detail, but the biggest factor in determining a school's allocation in any year is its enrollment. And right now, what we have for next school year is projected enrollment, right? We call it ECAS, and that's really a projection of next year's enrollment. And that, as we discussed a bit last week as well, the biggest allocation that schools receive are what we call the norm allocation. Those are the classroom teachers, the administrators, clerical staff, et cetera, that schools receive based on their enrollment. And so a school's projected enrollment is going to determine the largest amount of their resources in any given year. Enrollment decline is the primary driver, and what we see is that enrollment decline is the most substantial at our highest need schools. And that's what you see in that table below. So in the first column, this is organized by semi-quintile. So these are the most recent semi-quintiles, the quintiles that were the SENI rankings that were used to determine SENI allocations for next school year. So these are the very latest SENI rankings and the schools within each of these quintiles. And you'll see there the enrollment decline, the average enrollment decline within each of those quintiles. And we do see the highest level of enrollment decline at our highest SENI quintile schools, 6.3%. 4.9% decline for high, 4% for moderate, 2.4% for low, and 1.8% for lowest. So the average change in total budget, which is the next column, very closely tracks those average percentage enrollment declines. And so the average change in total budget, this is also an average of the schools within each quintile, very closely is in close parallel to those enrollment declines. So for highest, 6% year over year, for high, 5.1%, for moderate, 3.5%, for low, 1.5% decline, and for lowest, an actual 0.5 percentage point increase. So I want to pause here for a second. You might be asking yourself, why would schools see an average increase in allocations? Even though their enrollment decline for the lowest quintile schools was still a decline, much less of a decline than our other schools. And the reason is, even the norm allocations that schools receive, they get more expensive every year. The biggest example of that are benefit costs. So benefit costs go up each year. The cost of the premiums for the benefit plans that we provide for our employees goes up each year. And so you could still see a school get the exact same number of, let's say, to use an example, teacher positions from one year to the next, but the cost of that same number of teachers will go up. Costs go up over time. And so that is why you might see, even in spite of enrollment decline, a slight increase in the overall cost of what's allocated. So this is an apples to apples comparison. This is comparing the way the dollars that were allocated for the current school year during budget development, as well as the allocations that were provided during budget development for next school year. That way we're doing a real apples to apples comparison. And so what it doesn't include are any changes that happened in norm day. So during norm day, obviously, as you're well aware, our enrollment for the current school year was substantially lower than had previously been projected. That would have reduced the norm allocations after norm day. And so these percentage changes are a little bit higher, given that these were the 25-26 figures are pre-norm day, where we did see those enrollment counts being substantially lower. I also want to highlight that the change in total budget that you see highlighted here will ultimately be smaller after the restoration of unfunded position. And this could be particularly true at our semi-highest and high schools. So when we met with the board last week, as part of the RIF authorization, we mentioned that we were moving forward with a RIF that was smaller than the actual number of positions that were closed during budget development. And it's really because the focus of the RIF was on central office positions. There were several school-based positions that were not part of the RIF authorization. And so while we're aggressively going to be using attrition, that includes retirements and other ways that employees might separate from the district, to place people whose positions were closed but were not RIF'd into those vacant positions, it's almost certain that we're going to end the year with positions that we call that they're restored, meaning that they're going to continue to be employed by the district. And so depending on where those restored employees, which schools they're at or which schools they're assigned to, it could very materially change the figures that you see here, and meaning it'll make the year-over-year changes smaller. You'll see a hyperlink there, that blue text at the very bottom. When clicking that link, you're going to see several pages of a table that show the school-level detail that is summarized here. And so that table is organized by board district for your convenience, and you'll be able to see the year-over-year budget change at individual schools. You'll also see information about the enrollment change from this year's norm day enrollment to next year's ECAST or projected enrollment. And you'll also see some calculations that show those figures on a per pupil basis. So not only in terms of total dollars, but on a per pupil basis. And so this again is just a summary. I think it's a trend that many board members have pointed out previously at board meetings where we do see larger variance and changes at our highest needs school. But again, that's principally because of the change in enrollment that we see across the district. So the budget process is, as always, ongoing. Where we find ourselves now is in the end of February. Next steps are, of course, continued analysis, as you've seen here, on on contract spending, on non-labor spending, on the impact of different changes in allocations on schools. And so what we expect moving forward is in March, on March 10th, there's a board meeting for the second interim report. We're going to give an update on not only the current fiscal year's finances, but also on the 2 additional out years, the 26-27 and 27-28 fiscal year. In May, we'll receive the governor's budget, the May revision or May revise. That's going to provide some updated information on proposals from the governor's office with respect to next year's budget. And then finally in June, both the budget and LCAP hearing and the budget and LCAP adoption. And I can now pause for any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. And in your last slide, I see there's nothing in April. What could be taking place in April? I know our legislation is going to be going through a lot of bills and
Yes.
money and committees and all of that, but
That's a good point. So there's obviously that the advocacy has been happening already, and that definitely continues from today moving forward. All the time that we have between now and the May revision to continue to advocate for the full release of the $5.6 billion that was held back by the governor, as well as advocacy for additional funds to be allocated to LA Unified and to districts across the state. So you're bringing up a really good example of the hard work that happens in April. Of course, it's happening now. It's happened last month. It's going to happen in March, but certainly in April as well, because there's a lot of important things that are happening at the state level legislatively that could impact our funding levels.
yeah, I think April is a very important month where we really need to be hands on deck and advocating it throughout Sacramento. Okay, so I will open up the floor to whoever wants to start questioning. Okay, Carla, Ms. Gregor.
Hi, Saman. Thank you. On slide 6, I noticed that the labor percentage has not gone back to pre-pandemic. And so I'm wondering, is this also causing us not to meet the 55% classroom that we're supposed to meet?
It's a factor. So non-labor expenditures that you see here are not part of the 55%. So it is a factor, but there are a lot of other labor expenses that are also not part of the 55%. And there are, so I think we covered some examples previously, but generally everything outside of the classroom, whether labor or non-labor, is not included in the 55%. So that would include important things like psychiatric social workers, attendance counselors, a lot of the expenditures that are still providing direct services to students, but are not based on the rules of the calculation included in the 55%. But you're absolutely right that non-labor spending does contribute to that as well.
And then I noticed that it ends, this particular slide ends with 24-25. Others go on to, making a prediction, I guess, of what it's going to look like in the future. And so where are we? Why do we not have 25, 26? Is it?
So the graph that you see here are final expenditures, actual final expenditures. And last year where we have those final expenditures was the last school year.
We don't have them for...
Well, because we're still in the middle of the current school year, we don't have final total expenditures.
Right, okay.
But we will have at second interim, which is just next month, updated projections on how much we expect to spend in every category for the current school year.
All right.
And so this is really meant to be just a backwards looking so that we don't kind of mix together expenditure figures and budget figures. The other graphs that you point out that do include this year and next year are budget figures. And so we always try to be careful to make sure that we're comparing like for like. And so expenditures against expenditures or budget against budget. But ultimately, at the end of the current fiscal year, but even in March, we're going to have a projection for how much we think we're going to spend this year. And then at the end of the fiscal year, we'll then have final figures.
And I'm wondering, because in this slide, you have percentages only, not actual dollar amounts. Is there a way we can look at the dollar
Of
amounts
course.
as well?
Of course.
Okay, because I'd like to see that. And then for slide 7, slide 7, so these were the actual expenditures, right?
Correct.
I'm wondering, how do they, this is books and supplies, which is very.
Correct.
It's the one that we always ask about. So how do these actual numbers compare to what was budgeted for those years?
Okay, let me make a note. Yeah, we can certainly provide that.
Yeah, I know you probably, I don't know if you have it right now.
I
but
don't, I'm sorry.
Okay, so if you could provide that at one point, that would be.
Of course.
And then just wondering if the budget for books and supplies has followed the same trend since 14-15. Has there been a shift? I would like to see what the trend was for the budgeting of those, of books and supplies.
Okay.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll hand it off to other folks. Let's see, professional. Okay, so it says here, object codes 5800. What is object codes 5800?
So, per the California School Accounting Manual, there are object codes. They're numerical codes that we have to report spending within those categories. So we also budget using these codes, and we have expenditures within these codes. And so the name of what's the name given to the object code 5800, or the description, is professional consulting services. The 5800 is just the code. So depending on what document you might be looking at, sometimes you'll see both the name and the code. Sometimes you might only see the code. So we try to include both just so that folks have the ability to interpret other reports that they might see. But it's a numerical code. We don't decide the code. It's all school districts report using.
So it's all professional contracts. It's
That's
like
right.
this big umbrella.
That's
All
right.
right, because I noticed that even as of last year, we were still pretty high compared to pre-pandemic
Yes.
levels, right? In both the other restricted and general fund restricted.
That's right.
Unrestricted, I mean.
That's right.
So, like by a lot, it seems like. And then you also, I think you said in this slide about special ed expenses going up in other restricted? Is that what you said in this slide?
Yeah, so there's a national trend that no doubt you're familiar with, where we do see a lot of earlier identification of students with disabilities. And so what we're seeing nationwide is, as a result of that, higher levels of spending. And depending on and I know you already know all this, but depending on a student's IEP, some of the services provided are often required to be provided by non-public agencies or NPS, non-public schools. And so those expenditures, while they are direct services to students, they still do show up as non-labor because we're required to account for them in that way.
And they're contracted.
Yes,
Right.
so NPA and NPSs are considered contracted services.
And so you're saying that the expenses for special ed have gone up because the identification of students has gone up.
That's one factor.
And also, we are contracting out more for their services? Would
Well, I
that
think
be
there's a general trend for overall special education that is not just about the percentages of students that are identified to have disabilities and have an IEP, but also that students with more moderate to severe needs. And so there is also, and this is also a national trend, where within the population of students with disabilities, a larger share of them have moderate to severe needs that require additional, more substantial services and supports. And so it's the combination of trends there that you see, again, nationwide, that results in not only larger amount of spending on, often required within IEPs for non-public agency and non-public school supports, but also on the labor side, where we also see, of course, because we're providing those increased services.
So, I'm going to want to see what those expenses are for special ed, because I think a big concern, not only in LAUSD, but I actually think across the state, a lot of folks are concerned that districts are contracting out a lot of special ed services, and it's really increased the amount of contracts that are sought by districts instead of, bringing the workforce to to our district, it seems that that's a trend in the state. I don't know if it's a national trend, but I know I would hope that we analyze what that is so that we can change that. So we can shift that trend and stop contracting out.
It is definitely an area that we track very closely. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we honor what the IEP process calls for.
Totally get it, yeah.
And there's a lot of advocacy generally from parents who want to see particular targeted services for students that sometimes the district cannot provide. And then even when we can, there's advocacy to have external resources, and that's, kind of a legal obligation. I think one of the key things when we talk about special ed in general and tying it to kind of April advocacy and conversations that are happening at the legislative level is that we know that there's opportunities to legislate solutions that would actually help us generate additional dollars to offset the impact of increased mod to severe student enrollment. When you look at the district's overall enrollment, we've seen a decline. When it comes to special ed, it's actually gone the other way. We went from 65,000 students since kind of the post-pandemic environment to now about 72,000. So they represent a greater share, and they also happen to come with greater needs. And one of the things that we know is at the state level, the factors that are included in the AB 602 allocation do not account very clearly for that growth of need in special ed. So it's definitely a point of advocacy that we'll be leaning into with Martha and the team.
Definitely, it seems like it should be one of our priorities then, if it is that an issue. And I totally understand that the IEP is an individual education plan. The parents have a full say-so, but I do think that we should look and analyze how we're training our own staff, how we're allocating our own staff. I think a lot of the reasons why parents choose to go private is because they don't trust that the services are going to meet this, the levels of a private person. I just think people in general tend to think that if you pay for something, that you'll get a better service. So I think we need to reestablish that trust with people, and one of the ways that we do it is to have highly trained folks and well-paid folks who can do this kind of work, because I think both educators, principals, administrators, the school community in general appreciates and values when we have our own employees doing the work, just because there's a commitment and a connection to the school community, and that goes a long way than just coming in for a few hours and being very limited in what you can do to support. So I would like to see more of a breakdown of where our funding is going in terms of special ed, and then an analysis of that, and then also like an advocacy plan, because I don't know if it was in the advocacy priority list, and that's something that we should make it a point of doing. So I'll stop there, and I'll ask more later. Thank you.
Thank you for the breakdown and the graphs. I'm the visual learner here. Wanted to kind of continue with what Carla Grego was sharing about the special ed and get a little more detail, and whoever can share as to the services that we do provide and those that we have to outsource because we do not have those services within our school sites, being that there may be, at the NPS, as I heard, do we have sites that have the ability to service those students, or that is a must place with a contract?
So if I can clarify a couple things. So on the services part, we could provide a continuum of services. That might be from speech and language services to the actual special education teacher and support, occupational therapy, physical therapy, so on and so forth. Sometimes we do need to access non-public agency support. As you all have stated, it's an individualized educational plan. And so we want to make sure that we're clear about what kind of services a student needs based on their IEP. Sometimes in those conversations, as required by IDA and Ed Code, it may come up that a non-public agency needs to be providing those supports. Many of the times, I will say, Primary reason why non-public agencies are tapped is sometimes the perceived training that folks have. I think as Board Member Grego has talked about, ongoing training of our staff is a critical element. If we're identifying someone as having a certain kind of expertise, we need to make sure that they receive that ongoing training to provide that. So that way at the IEP team meeting, people can talk about the types of services and qualifications a provider has. However, I think it's important to note, it's still an IEP team decision. And so those types of decisions are things that we, of course, provide guidance information, but it is an IEP team decision. But we can break down those costs further so folks can see where.
Yeah, that would be helpful, just so we can actually see where the costs. And the same thing with our high-dose tutoring. I know that it's kind of connected in one of the slides with another cost. And if it was able to be broken down, when on page 11 you says tutoring and after-school programs, how much of that is high-dose tutoring, how much of that is tutoring, how much of that is after-school programming, because it just giving us a blanket dollar figure doesn't really help us to see where that tutoring is, and then, of course, obviously, the return for the investment. And as we talk about outsourcing, are those opportunities for tutoring, can it be done with the said staff that we have now after school? We used to have EYS, SEY, whatever the alphabet was, but that no longer existed. So if that's an opportunity for our teachers to be able to tutor their students knowing where they are, is that something that we're looking at to be able to bring those funding back to our workforce?
So, Samantha, I don't know if you want to clarify on that budget piece here, exactly what's represented there, and then I'll speak more to where tutoring is, the direction we're moving with tutoring.
Sure. So an important point here is that this is principally general fund restricted that is supporting these types of expenses. That's true for both tutoring and really all after-school programs. The biggest source of funding for those programs is ELOP, the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program. And so this is all general fund, but that component, that piece right there is restricted. It's important still. It's a major program. It's a major priority of the district, but it is general fund restricted, and so I wanted to make that point.
So to clarify then on tutoring, as we've been looking at tutoring over time, when ELOP funds were originally provided, I mean, it was right after the pandemic. And so clearly people wanted to make sure that we were offering extended learning opportunities for our students because of the fact that we know there was so much to catch up on. And so over time, however, what we found was we didn't have staff necessarily able at that time to provide those services as much as schools needed. And so vendors were, in addition to, so we have locally designed, which is our own staff, as well as high dosage tutoring partners. Those folks provided additional support. Over time, what we have been seeing, because the investment in tutoring has decreased over time, we are finding that more and more of our staff are interested in staying after school or working on Saturdays and providing that type of extended learning opportunity. And our schools want to be able to use, their own staff to be able to do that. Some schools will still need vendor support to be able to do that. I know DOI had sent information to the board on how our tutoring, the impact of our tutoring has been. I think it's been a critical part to our success. I think it's a necessary one that we will continue. However, with ELOP funding not having as much carryover over time, we are making some decisions on, one, by using locally designed models, we can use our own staff, and then how do we want to start to shift some of that investment in tutoring where it's appropriate. As students do better, you don't need as much tutoring offering as you typically have offered in the past. But that's one of the things that we're weighing and considering and moving towards a stronger transition to locally designed.
Great. And then on slide 6, you mentioned the increases in 2021 attributed to the COVID testing. Is it possible to list those other areas that made this increase so significant? I mean, COVID testing is one, but I'm sure there's other things that
Yeah.
we can look at to be able to see and say, this is why the increase is there and we're no longer have that, so that's why the numbers have changed.
Yes.
And then the insurance premiums, I know you mentioned that this is a large number on slide 10. Now, with this premium, are we gaining funds from this premium, or is this just money out the door and there's no impact coming back to the district?
No, so what we're paying for is insurance coverage. So kind of like we have in maybe our home lives, where we have coverage for property insurance or auto insurance, and sometimes even liability insurance. That coverage allows for the district when certain claims are made to have either some or most of the cost of the claim covered by the insurance company. And so the devil's always in the details. There are many, many different types of coverage that the district has to protect against those risks. But it's meant, generally speaking, kind of like in our own personal lives, to prevent against kind of these outsized occurrences that might happen that would have a very substantial negative impact on the district's finances if we didn't have the coverage. Now, the type of coverage we have is not just determined by the types of risks that we have, but also based on what's available in the insurance market. And sometimes, depending on the year, sometimes coverage and certain types of coverage is easier to get. Sometimes it's harder to get. Sometimes it becomes more expensive and less expensive. And so the district is always making decisions on the types of coverage and the details of the coverage that we have to meet the best needs of the district. But really, it's meant to protect the district financially.
And I know it's needed, and I guess the question for me is these premiums, I mean, kind of like life insurance, right? You pay into certain life insurance where at some point in time you may be able to cash out. And I'm wondering, in our premiums, is there a way for us, are we gaining interest in some of these premiums that we have across within every year? Do we see that kind of change or trajectory?
So, unlike in some life insurance policies, like universal policies that you
Yes.
mentioned, where you kind of have capital accumulation, you have growth in the value, and even upon death, there's still a remaining value. That concept doesn't really exist for school districts. However, through our captive, we are generating returns on the funds within the captive. And so that is one of the substantial benefits of a captive, is that those funds, while they're there to capitalize the captive, meaning to provide the funding necessary to pay claims, the funds that are within the captive earn investment returns. And sometimes when we're seeing large increases in investment earnings in the marketplace, like we've seen over the last few years, that does very substantially benefit the district.
Got it. And then I guess over time, just being able to see what this number looks like, because I mean, this is a very large number. Just as you broke down some of our other numbers, it'd be great to just see how it fluctuates and how we're able to gain some interest from that. And I think that's it. I'll
Thank you.
let someone else go. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Merwin?
Okay, thank you, and thanks to my colleagues for asking some of the questions. Appreciate this. I think as we vocalized last week, should have had this a few months prior, but noted. Question, just on starting at slide 7. So books and supplies. I know we've discussed this before, but it is a place where schools park carryover, even if they're not books or supplies. Because there's no other place to put it, right?
Yes. Yeah. Do you want me to
Yeah.
describe a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, because I mean, Ms. Griego asked a question about budgeted versus expenditures, which was one of mine. I think that's really important, but we hear about this a lot, and because the expenditures are usually lower than what's budgeted.
Yes.
And so I think to the public, it seems like that's an area where money is just kept. And so I just think every time we have an opportunity to talk about this,
Yes.
if you could explain why.
Sure.
And then if there's any state advocacy that's needed around, like, we've talked about allowing schools to maybe do multi-year budgets the way that we do, but if I'm a principal, and granted, in this year we've swept carryover, but in the past when we were giving 100% of carryover or various percentages, if a principal said, "Hi, I'm going to hold some of this money for next year," even if that wasn't a district policy, this is where they parked it. So can you just explain that whole?
Sure. So first, the budget book, the budget that is adopted each year, and our first interim reports, whenever we report our finances, it's a roll-up of the entire district budget. So as you point out, it's a roll-up or an aggregation of all school budgets, all central office budgets in total. And so when we look at the budget for books and supplies, it's a roll-up again of all school and non-school budgets for books and supplies. And the way discretionary funds are allocated during budget development to schools, it's in the form of dollars. So CENI is maybe the best example of that. And so each year, schools, depending on the different factors that determine a school's allocation for CENI, receive those funds and then determine how to budget them. A number of positions, maybe some funding for certain contracts for professional development. Just making up some examples. And then typically what happens when schools during budget development have an amount that has not been budgeted in some of those other categories that they want maybe to decide later what to do with those funds, it remains in one of the categories that is books and supplies. Within books and supplies, there are several subcategories. Instructional materials, there's even one called pending distribution, where sometimes before the school decides where to budget those funds, they are kind of put in a pending distribution subcategory. And what happens during the school year, once the school year starts, schools will sometimes move money from that budgeted area where they were kind of parking it, to use your words, and words that we've used before. And they might use it instead for substitute teachers because they're doing a professional development opportunity. Or they might move it to X time or something else. And so even during the year, budgets can move. Those are called budget adjustments. It happens, and that's okay, that's a good thing. We want schools, based on changing needs or priorities, even within a school year, to make changes as appropriate. And so, but even after those changes get made, even as the budget might get moved somewhere else, we have still seen historically that within the books and supplies categories, substantial underspend or amounts left over at the end of each year within the books and supplies budget. And in the past, what's happened, either all or some of those funds within CENI or the general fund school program would carry over. That changed going into next school year, but we did see those trends where oftentimes there was a substantial amount of spending when you're comparing the amount budgeted and the amount expended. And in part, it's because either the funds were not, one, they weren't spent, they weren't moved to another category and then spent, and it is a phenomenon that we've seen over the last many years.
One of the things, when you respond to our requests on the budgeted versus expenditures, I don't know how best to visualize this, and maybe it's in an upcoming meeting, but I think the concern or the claim out there is that because of that underspend, that is money that we're kind of double counting, or it's money that or undercounting, I guess is more accurate. That we're saying, like, if we actually know we're only going to spend $800 million and not $1 billion, that $200 million we could put on the table for raises, or that $200 million we could put on the table for PS, like lower. You know, that's what we hear from our partners. And so I think it would just be helpful to, as we articulate that, like, there is an element of truth. Like, if we don't have money for one thing, we can potentially use it for other things. But it's hard to plan prospectively because most of that money is at school sites.
Yeah, let me respond to that. So yes, you're right. It is true that historically we've seen the expenditure as a percentage of budgets and books and supplies be relatively low. And one thing that we don't expect to see moving forward is probably the same trend. One, because the budgets in those areas have already been substantially reduced. As I mentioned, during budget development, what we saw was a prioritization of positions, where there's a much higher likelihood that those will get expended. And so the variance, or the difference between what's budgeted in books and supplies and what's spent, we don't expect that variance to be as large as it has in the past, just because the budgets themselves have been reduced so substantially in those areas. But another important factor is that when we come to the board for a first interim, with the first interim report and the second interim report, we're already projecting how much is going to get spent based on the months of expenditures that we already have retrospectively. So when we look at first interim, there's several months of expenditure data that is used to project till the end of June. And then at second interim, we have even more months of expenditure data that allows us to refine those projections. And so the underspend in those areas, no, the projections are not always 100% accurate, right? Like the spending could end up being higher than what we project at second interim or lower. But the impact to our ending balances of that underspend is already reflected at first interim and then second interim. Another factor that's relevant is when we look just at the school portion of books and supplies, where we do see that we have seen that substantial underspend, is that those funds in the past were in our assigned balances because they carried over. They weren't unassigned because we knew that in the past, based on the past practice, they would be carried over at the school level. And the fiscal stabilization plan that was updated most recently in December had one of the lines was the impact of the carryover. A large portion of the carryover, as you point out, is from underspend in budgets for books and supplies. The benefit of that underspend, the financial benefit of that underspend, is already reflected in the fiscal stabilization plan because of the assumption that carryover and sending the general fund school program would be zero. So I guess more broadly what I'm saying is that we reflect the impact to our bottom line, and therefore the bottom line meaning our ending balances, our unassigned ending balances, and how much money we have in those reserves and balances to spend on certain expenses is already reflected when we update our financials through that financial cycle of first interim, second interim, then the June adopted budget.
And I think it would be interesting when we have the analysis. I mean, the variance, like we want the variance to be as small as possible, right? And because I think to the point that advocates and partners are making is that like if your variance is always large, then you are budgeting inappropriately or sloppily, such that you could have spent the money better, because then this money that's carrying over is actually money that should have gone to the kids that were at school that year. And so we do, I know that schools are, and we see it, I think, with savvier principals, and so we're working on principal training and budget specialists, but we want that variance to be little, because then we want to say the money we budgeted for and this board approved is going to what we approved it for. Because if we realized that we were going to have extra $100 million that wasn't spent, then we can discuss all the other priorities that we have in limited. I know I'm saying something obvious, but I think that is what, I think the community, when they are criticizing or asking very legitimate questions, is about that. Well, like if you knew that, why didn't you plan better so that we could actually give more in raises or could actually lower class size even farther?
So philosophically, I agree with you that we always venture to spend the resources in the year that they're generated. Right now, we're spending more than the amount of resources that are generated, right? Last year, we spent even more than the new revenues we received, but we'd still have those reserves that allowed that to be possible. Now, I know you weren't characterizing it as sloppy. You were kind of conveying what sometimes is said out in the public, but if a school or budget holder were to park the money somewhere else, instead of books and supplies, money that they didn't quite know what they wanted to do with it, instead was budgeted in contracts, you would just see the variance there.
Yes, but I guess one of the things I've advocated for is why we don't have a line item, like an accounting code, that is like, next year's spend or 2-year projects. And I know that we can't, but that is where, because yes, you're going to have to choose. It's going to be parked and there's going to be variance, but the way to limit that variance is actually have a future spend. I mean, it's kind of like this pending distribution or disbursement or something, but it would, at least we'd be then more accurate with what we're doing. I guess the other thing, and I was talking to our deputy superintendent about this, is, years ago when I first got here, I was encouraging the district to look at software like OliveView, or I know we've worked with OpenGov, but there are products out there that do translate these very esoteric accounting codes into what's actually happening. And I think one of the challenges even for this board is trying to figure out. So I would encourage us as part of that budget transparency work to still think about that. I guess, what percentage of books and supplies is school-based of that object code is school-based versus non?
I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head, but we can.
I'd love that as a follow-up. And then also, and I know similar but slightly different, what percentage of the non-labor costs that we're talking about are school-controlled versus central office? Because I think that is one of the, when I've talked to the budget team around a lot of these contracts, it's been interesting to me how many are school-directed. Like some of the things you're talking about, what LLP or tutoring, or even if it's a field trip and they have to use a contracted bus vendor because the districts are not available. Like a lot of this is school-generated, which doesn't mean it's not worth scrutiny, but it's like it means that the beef that folks have or the questions they have are really at the school site. Like what So I am curious what the percentage of the labor cost is. I think this was a helpful articulation. As some of my colleagues have said, some of it is like a deeper dive, and I'll get to special ed in a minute. But can you help me understand on slide 8, that final column for 425 for objects code 5800 is about 1.2 billion. If you add up that final column on the right, but then on slide 9, which is I know longer, like more object codes, we're talking about we're talking about 2.3 billion. So I'm just trying to understand how some of these slides interact with one another.
So first, the final column, the grand total is the 566 million.
Okay, that's not. I added that as a separate.
Yeah, no, that's just we've put
Got
that
it.
at the top as
Got
just
it,
the
got it,
grand
got it,
total
got it.
for each.
That's helpful. I added that to the. Okay, so then how does that 566? So that's one object code, and then on slide 9. I'll also note that your slide 9 has 4,000 to 6,999, and our version has 5,000 to 5,999. Like at the header for our slide 9 is just the 5,000 object codes, and yours says 4,000 to.
This slide is all of non-labor, which is the objects starting in 4,000 all the way through all of the 6,000.
So is ours wrong? Ours is the same figure and dollar amount. It just says 5,000 at the top.
Oh, my apologies.
So that is correct. It's okay. Again, this goes, not that I can tell you what the individual object codes are, but I'm curious. Okay. So the 2.3 billion on slide 9 and the 566 million, like what is on one and not the other?
The $566 million is a subset
Of this
the
one.
2.3 billion.
Got it.
One of the codes.
Yeah, there are different ways we're trying to slice it to tell the overall picture. In some cases, we're zooming in to general fund only within professional services contracts. In other cases, like here on slide 9, we're zooming out for all non-labor, but then cutting it in a different way that's showing kind of unavoidable, which again, I said is not within the California accounting code. There's no unavoidable category. We're just trying to differentiate the kinds of spending that we know typically for districts cannot be avoided, just to paint the picture about the way that these funds are spent and for what purposes.
Another kind of discrepancy or question I have about the slides, and then I'll go back to some of those unavoidable costs. But on slide 12, like if you look starting at, let's look at that slide 9. If you go back to that slide 9 for 24-25, that school sites is 953 million. Then if you look on slide 12 for the 24 school year, the school site spending is just 250.35 million. So what's part of what's that other 650 million?
So this slide 12 is looking at other services and other operating budgets only. And so for these, the school's share is smaller than the school's share of total non-labor. And so at the top, you'll see this is the object codes, the
Okay.
5,000.
Missing books and supplies.
Got it. So
That's
that's
right.
why I was going to, because on our
you.
version that says it's the same object codes, but on your version, so our slide 9 only has the same object codes as that, and that's why I was confused by those numbers.
Okay, my apologies.
Got it. No, that's helpful. And then, okay, so just going, yeah, I guess, I think unavoidable, the term unavoidable, I get what you're saying. I mean, maybe it's like maintenance of district, because I think to Ms. Griego's point and others, there are some things that are, the actual dollar amount is maybe, is less unavoidable. Like when we think about legal settlements when we think about utilities and some of the like kind
Yeah.
of space allocation. I also think I echo Ms. Griego's call for that next level of data with special ed, but like I also agree with her line of inquiry that some of that like is, and actually I have a question for Dr. Estrada. In our district BIIs, are they required to do any training?
Not currently, there isn't a required training, and so we do provide training, but it's been part of our onboarding, but I do think there should be required annual training. I think those are the things that we're trying to explore, especially as people get certain additional certification and training. So we do provide that, but it's not to the degree that I think we could potentially provide.
Because and I'll put an asterisk, I know that's more about SPED as opposed to the budget right now, but I think to Ms. Griego's point, like it is the IP team decision, but some of the perception that what you pay for is better is actually grounded in a reality that we have no required training for our district BIIs. So I'd really like to see as a district priority required training for BIIs, and then I think you have a way to reduce, not necessarily the MPSs, but the MPAs, because, so I think, again, that's just, I took issue a little bit with the unavoidable, because I think there are ways that we can reduce those.
Yeah, let me characterize that a little differently. It's not unavoidable doesn't mean it will always be in those amounts or sums. Obviously, you're well aware of substantial energy efficiency projects happening across the district that will lower utility costs that otherwise would have been incurred. Certainly with insurance premiums, as I described a little bit earlier, we are always making decisions each year upon renewal of policies to determine what makes the most sense in terms of the trade-off between what it costs and what it's protecting. And so unavoidable doesn't mean, again, that it's always going to be in these amounts or it's always going to be in higher amounts. We always want to scrutinize what we're spending and seeing if it's benefiting the district and our students. But we will always be paying some amount of utilities, and we'll always be paying some amount of
Mandated
waste
textbook
removal
costs, yes.
and textbooks. And so, of course, working with the procurement department and negotiating hard and making sure we're getting the best price and value will always help in lowering what we might otherwise have spent.
Yeah, understood. And I think that's a great segue. I just have a couple more questions. On slide 11, one of the things many of us have asked for is around, to your point, the kind of evaluations of some of these programs and contracts, especially with limited resources. And so I just want to make a plug again for the evaluation of the tutoring and after-school programs, the IT infrastructure. One thing too, I know I've seen posts on social media, and I think my colleagues have as well, talking about a 1.6 billion in tech contracts. Do you know where they get that number? Because I know here we have 58 million, another 26.7 for the actual computers and devices, 22 for digital tools, and I know this is part of a broader conversation we're hoping to have, but do you know where that 1.6 billion comes from that we're seeing? I know UTLA put it out in an infographic.
Well, obviously, we are spending in contracts last year
This was just tech contracts.
$566 million, and so certainly it's not possible for the tech contracts within any 1 year to be that high because the spending was a third of that in all contracts. And so the only thing I don't know, let me just answer directly. I don't know where that figure comes from. I would guess it's looking at multi-year contracts over a long period of time and summing them, but I don't know how they've arrived at that figure.
And it generally, it comes down to what the definition of tech is, right? And so when you look at the category, you can look at tech as hardware and devices, right? So you're thinking about laptops, iPads, et cetera. Network infrastructure, which actually some of it is reimbursed through E-rate. So it shows as a spend here out of general fund, but then we get reimbursed to offset that cost. From the federal government. When you look at digital tools, what's actually utilized to provide supplemental instructional supports, and so it just varies. Licenses and access, depending on how those licenses are being utilized, whether it's on the instructional side, operational side to support transportation, facilities to food services. So that the categories can be broad, but the purpose varies depending on how it's being utilized. And I know that there's usually a catch-all under technology, but can be broken down. I think that we would benefit from a disaggregation on how it's actually being spent, because it's being spent on students and to support operational needs of the district.
Yeah, and that's definitely a conversation I know some of us want to have, that disaggregation and then the instructional piece of it. So on slide 11, those, besides the evaluative piece, those budgets, or I know different slides have different slices, but like, is that money coming from the buckets on slide 11? On slide 8, like those, within that object code 5800, that's where you're then getting the 87 million for school transportation, or like where?
Correct.
Okay, got it.
Correct.
Last thing on this, and then one question on impact analysis. I know I've asked this many times. I did a resolution about this that I don't think has been fully responded to. A conversation around ELOP spending specifically. We hear about it a lot from schools when it comes to field trips, but also after school programming, and so and maybe Dr. Rivas would be open to a future COW specifically for that ELOP presentation. But it is in a board resolution I did, and we can resurface that. But I think besides just talking about it in this conversation, would love the ELOP plan, given that's a relatively new pot of money, and there's a lot of exciting things that can happen there. And I guess, I'll pause. I will say thank you for putting, at least it wasn't in the presentation on slide 18, but if you look at the link, the school-by-school budget details, it is there per pupil, which is something I've asked about because I think that's a helpful analysis. I will just channel Ms. Ortiz-Franklin by saying that it is a PDF, which makes it harder to manipulate. Not manipulate. Manipulate is the word, but that sounds nefarious. To filter and sort. So if we could maybe get that as an Excel file. But I'll note for folks that the per pupil change is included in that link on slide 18. So thanks, Dr. Rivas.
On slide 27, books and supplies, does that include technology such as like laptops and connectivity devices?
It can when they're purchased in smaller quantities, typically.
Smaller quantities?
Yeah, so they can, and this is a little convoluted, unfortunately, but sometimes those types of purchases will be reflected in non-capitalized equipment. But often when it's a school purchase of a small number of technology, then it's typically shows up as books and supplies, even though it's not a book or really a supply.
Define capital expenditures for our audience.
Sure. So a capital expenditure are things that have, to use the technical term, then I'll explain it in a layperson's terms. So a capital expense is something that has basically a useful life of more than a year. So that's kind of how the IRS defines it. It's something that lasts for more than a year, and it's a physical thing. And so the biggest example for a school district of a capital expenditure are facility construction projects, comprehensive modernization projects, but also certain technologies are also required to be capitalized because they have a useful life of more than a year, meaning they can be used for more than a year. And so what gets reflected as capitalized or non-capitalized is actually governed by accounting rules. The accounting rules determines whether it's capitalized or non-capitalized, and there were some recent changes in accounting rules that actually changed so that more things are reflected as capitalized than uncapitalized, like for example leases, which most of us don't think of as a physical thing. So that's the high-level overview of what's considered to be a capital item.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And my main question is school transportation. $87.4 million in school transportation. What in the world are we buying for $87.4 million?
That is primarily our SPED contracted route services.
Who drives the buses?
It is contracted Teamsters drivers
Zoom.
through Zoom and STA.
Well, how about if we use LAUSD school buses and LAUSD drivers? Can we save 87.3 million?
It would require us to actually take on additional equipment. And we're talking about the needed specialized buses that are required to transport particular students. And the district has historically, for decades utilize a contracted model so that you have flexibility to acquire particular buses. There are upwards of 19 different variations of buses that are intended to serve the different unique needs of students, the type of lifts and equipment that are necessary. And so it allows the district to have flexibility on how it actually serves the student. But is there an opportunity to actually identify savings by reducing contracts? Yes, but that's actually through the mechanism of streamlining common bell schedules, looking at eligibility around transportation. There are a number of different strategies that we intend to execute on that are intended to optimize our available fleet and drivers so that we're actually servicing more with our drivers, our buses, and less reliant on contracts.
And I agree with everything you said, especially about aligning bell schedules so there's an easy pickup for kids. And I agree that we need specialized school buses, but $87.4 million worth, in my thinking, is just way, way too much. But I understand what you said. Thank you.
And on that question on transportation, is that all that we're spending, or this is just the portion that's coming out of general funds?
This is
right?
general fund, and these are with our major vendors where the spend is more than $5 million.
There's additional expenditures on transportation, like grants, or that come out of grants, right?
So
there's not just the total.
There's capitalized expenditures associated with the acquisition of buses in our fleet.
Yeah.
Grant-based acquisition that are focused on the charging infrastructure that we're deploying. And then ongoing just maintenance, which are, we have to purchase equipment, I would say the replacement parts for a lot of our vehicles. And so usually we have contracts in place so that we can order a fuel pump or anything that's necessary for our fleet as we're maintaining them.
So on all of these, on slide 11, all of these major expenditures, this is just a snippet, right? There's
That's right.
actually
That's
more
right.
that we're spending. This
That's
is just
exactly
a
right.
portion.
Yeah.
Well, I'll have a question. Huh? I haven't had my turn. Yeah, I haven't had my turn. I just want to have a little turn. Just two questions for now. So several of the slides compare current levels for the fiscal year 22, which was the COVID, right? So
Yeah.
that seems obviously like an outlier
Yeah.
because of what was current. Could we also see comparisons of pre-pandemic baseline years for fiscal year 18 or 19, so that we can evaluate structural growth independent of one-time ESSER funds? I know you have it there, but just, you know, because it seems like we're always going there and comparing it, but I think we really need to be looking at 18, 19.
Okay.
You're right, of expenditures.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Just
Certainly,
wanted to see.
and we can even go further back than 14, 15. But these are, in each of these cases, actual expenditures, and so it does include 18, 19. It goes back about, a little bit more than 10 years, but we could always, there's a lot of historical data, and we could certainly look even further back. But we thought a 10-year time horizon would give a good idea. There'll be enough pre-pandemic years to kind of see what the trends look like before the pandemic. But then you're absolutely right, though, especially on this slide 8, like you're absolutely right. 21, 22 is a very substantial outlier in terms of the total expenditures.
And, let's see, sorry. How does the total cost of sustaining the district's one-to-one device model compare to traditional instructional investments, such as textbooks or library materials? Sorry. And has a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis confirmed that the current replacement schedule and digital portfolio are fiscally unsustainable or are fiscally sustainable?
So I don't have a comparison of the total cost of one-to-one device, which would include not just the devices themselves, but the software, the maintenance, the personnel, as compared to like textbooks. But we can certainly provide something like that. It is a substantial investment, though. I mean, without providing the exact dollar comparison, it is a substantial investment for the district. And it is kind of why we highlighted in terms of like the different kind of policy areas that directly impact spend, exactly that, the one-to-one devices. And this did come up a little bit in conversation at last week's board meeting. And so I can't speak to the research in terms of the impact on student learning, but certainly it's something that's worth interrogating moving forward as we face the very challenging financial outlook that we are facing.
And in terms of spending on professional services, are you able to break down the professional services spending by unrestricted versus restricted funds? So breaking it out and clarify how much of the unrestricted portion is discretionary versus legally mandated.
Yes. So what we have on this slide is we do have the restricted, but what we don't have is a distinction of legally mandated. And so but yes, we can provide that.
One last question has to do with the equity impact and our SENI schools. While enrollment decline is cited as a primary driver of reductions, the data show that SENI highest schools are facing allocation decreases of roughly 15%, nearly double the proportion of decline of the lowest quintile schools of about 7%. Even accounting for enrollment shifts, why are our highest need campuses absorbing larger proportional cuts? And have we fully reviewed contracted services and spending and central spending to determine what can be reduced, renegotiated, or brought in-house before those site-level reductions move forward for our highest and highest needs?
So if I can just answer the second question first. Yes, I mean, the budgets for non-labor and specifically for contracts has declined substantially from last year to this year and then even further from this year to next year. But that doesn't mean that the work is done. Obviously, the board has a substantial interest in it. The superintendent and the leadership of the district has a substantial interest in lowering those figures even further in the interest of addressing the financial outlook and to minimize the amount of reductions that otherwise would need to happen elsewhere. And so the answer to your question is yes, very much so. While the substantial reductions have already been made, the district will go further. And with respect to the year-over-year changes, I think you did highlight that the enrollment is the biggest factor. The fiscal stabilization plan included two major areas that had a direct impact on school allocations. The first was the carryover that we've talked a little bit about, and the second was the reduction in the SENI allocation. And the SENI total allocation was reduced from $700 to $601 million, but 14% reduction. But the impact on the school wasn't that every school saw a 14% reduction in their SENI allocation. Some schools would have experienced a larger reduction than 14%, others a smaller reduction than the 14%. And the reasons for it are, and I know you know this already, but the reason for it are because there are other factors that go into that SENI allocation. So there's the SENI ranking, which does change from year to year. In some cases, it's quite stable, but some schools will see a substantial change in their ranking. And then the enrollment decline also affects SENI, because SENI is allocated, while not based on total enrollment, it's instead based on the unduplicated count, but that's still affected by the trends that we see in enrollment. And so you will see a school that is the highest need school within that quintile that might see, because of all of those factors, a larger than a 14% decline in the SENI allocation. However, and I know we've discussed this before, but the SENI formula didn't change. So the way it's calculated, the fact that the top-ranked school gets 3x the per student rate as the lowest ranked school, that all stayed the same. And so the fiscal stabilization plan, the way that impacted schools was really just a portion of the year-over-year change that you see demonstrated here. There were other changes like federal grants that we always allocate based on the actual sums that we're going to receive, the norm changes that happen every year. And one thing I should point about the norm changes that probably the changes feel a lot more substantial for 26, 27, is that over the last few years, we've been implementing class size reduction as part of the previous agreement with UTLA. And so schools that still had substantial declines in enrollment might not have seen as big of a change in, for example, the number of teachers, because at the same time as there was declining enrollment, we were lowering class sizes. But because the class size enrollment was fully implemented by the current school year, we no longer have the class size reduction being implemented at the same time as schools are experiencing declining enrollment. And so that is just another relevant factor that the class size reduction that we saw over the last couple of years as it was being implemented did blunt the impact of declining enrollment that schools would have otherwise seen and that they typically have seen over the last 20 plus years.
And last question, as we approach the second interim next month and the May revise, which non-labor decisions remain flexible?
Well, I mean, contracts and non-labor spending is not subject to any statutory deadlines. Unlike positions, unlike employees that are subject to statutory deadlines, non-labor spending isn't. Now, there are, of course, the contracts themselves are certain agreements, and often the amount we spend on a contract is based on how much it's used. So it doesn't mean that we have to spend whatever the total value of the contract is. Other contracts, we are kind of committed to spending a certain amount that has been agreed upon and approved. So I think to answer your question, I think it's probably unlikely that we would reduce school budgets in non-labor. Their allocations have already been provided for next school year. They were already lower, as demonstrated here, than they were in the current year. So I think it's unlikely that we would explore reducing budgets at schools for non-labor, but everywhere else, it is possible. And that is kind of what I was alluding to about that while the budgets for those non-labor, especially the contracts, has substantially declined, that the work is not done. And that we're looking at not only savings beyond what's already been achieved in the budget for next year, and even for the remainder of the current school year. That is how significant our financial challenges are, that we really do need to reduce spending even further than we already have, and in the areas that you highlighted.
Like OPEB?
Yeah, so OPEB, yes, it's not non-labor technically speaking, but yes, the contributions for next school year wouldn't start until July at the earliest. Yeah.
There you go. You have any questions?
Sorry, I apologize. Earlier, I thought you had said you were done asking questions, and that's why I jumped in. But, all right. Let me see here. I don't know if this has been asked, but the tutoring contracts and after-school programs, are they separated? I think it's in slide 11 that it comes up where you talk about tutoring and, oh my gosh, I can't see. Tutoring and after-school programs. Is there a way we can separate those two to know what, he already has it.
Yes. Of that total, thank you, 5.4 million is attributable to after-school programs, and the balance is with tutoring companies. And these are just the major vendors kind of summed up, and the way we've categorized it here is really just to be as accessible for the public to understand. The way that things are sometimes coded, as we're required to in our like official financial documents can be a little inscrutable, like a little hard to understand. And so this was an attempt to try to categorize it in a way that was more meaningful. But anyways, the answer to your question is
And this tutoring is the high dose tutoring, right?
yes.
Pretty much.
Correct.
It's not the school-based one.
No, it's the high-dose tutoring that's virtual or in person.
Okay. And have we done an analysis of that and gotten some feedback from families and also the educators? Because just from speaking to folks, which is, just anecdotal, I know school sites have some issues with the tutoring because they don't get to see the data, and it's very difficult to track how the kids are doing and how to connect that to the instruction. So I'm wondering, do we have an analysis of how we're doing and some feedback from folks on these tutoring services?
So yes, and we can provide more of a deep dive for you, but they do gather feedback from principals for each of the different tutoring companies. That is part of how they get evaluated. Dr. Bias does do kind of like their own data dig of understanding, where they'll look at iReady data to say, how are they doing compared to us as a district overall based on that service. So we do go into that degree of feedback. But I do think, one of the things that we've heard, again, the dependence on our vendor partners was at a time when we didn't have staff always necessarily able and willing to work on those after school and weekends. But now, as over time, we've been decreasing that vendor contract because of the fact that more and more folks want to have their own locally designed. And then over time, our principals have also said they'd like to further transition over that. That's why, as we look at ELOP for 26-27, that's where we're reconsidering what the funding for tutoring is going to look like, and how do we start to shift it more to schools who are able to be able to do their locally designed. I think the other thing too with tutoring, remember that there was initially the ESSER funds that were used to also fund this as well. So slightly different funding source than ELOP that we've been using in the past few years since ESSER sunsetted.
All right. And then for the contracts that are above $5 million that you have in one of these, I'm wondering, have we also done an analysis for efficacy on these contracts or any student impact?
So for school transportation, I think Pedro described earlier the kind of the routes and the services that are being provided by the contracted transportation services. So it's more about meeting a lot of the requirements to transport our special education students. And then again, a lot of the other items are, I can't speak to the efficacy reviews that have happened, but a lot of them are based off of just either district policies or practices, and for example, like one-to-one devices, and I know that there had been some comments earlier and questions about whether we would want to further explore the efficacy, the impact on student learning of those practices. But I do think it's important, to your point, that we always evaluate, especially when we're in the fiscal circumstances that we are, to really evaluate all resources, even those that are funded in general fund restricted. While the primary challenge that we're facing is on the general fund unrestricted side, it doesn't mean that we don't want to closely monitor and evaluate the things that are in our general fund restricted budgets, because just because the main issue is in the unrestricted side doesn't mean we don't want to be effective in how we spend money elsewhere.
And then for slide 14, we have a projection for 2027, and I see a significant decrease in central office, right, for consulting services. So I'm wondering, are we projecting that because contracts are going to expire, we're not going to renew them? Are we projecting that we're doing an analysis of what we have so far?
Yeah.
Like what?
So
How did you make that
this is
projection?
the budget within this category for next school year, for the 26-27 school year as of today. So obviously the budget is finalized and approved ultimately by the board in June. And so this is how much, based off of budget development, and the blue is the schools, obviously schools making decisions about how much they're going to budget, regardless of any contracts that might exist. This is how much they're budgeting and basically how much they expect to spend next year. And then that's the same concept for the non-school, for the central office, is that through the central office reduction exercise, through the normal budget development that happens every year, this is the aggregate of all those decisions that have been made, which is to prioritize services that are being provided instead by people, even though there were substantial reductions in central office positions that were brought forward to the board last week. But departments and divisions also made reductions in these areas. And so you can reduce the budget for contracted services and therefore reduce the amount that gets spent without making any revisions to the contracts. You just spend less against them, if that makes sense. So it's not so much that this is reflecting a renegotiation or a cancellation as much as an expectation and almost a necessity based on the budget being made lower, that at most this is what would be spent in these areas next year.
All right. And then I do remember, thank you for this, and but I do remember we talked about a way that we can see the upcoming contracts for the year, because usually we get them right before our meeting, right? Our board meeting. And it would be nice to have them for a year. I mean, we should be able to know what contracts are coming up, which contracts need to be renewed. That way we can have a conversation as to whether,
In advance of it.
in advance
Yeah.
of a meeting,
Yeah.
right? So I don't know, I'm requesting that orally, but if we need to put it in writing, we could do that as well. But I think it would help me make decisions when I know what our outlook looks like, and in terms of the plans that we have for any contracts.
Carla, we must decide what is in advance. What does that mean, in advance? Okay, we need a clarification.
Okay, thank you. I would say a year. I mean, we should know, right? A year ahead. At the beginning of the fiscal year, we should know what's up ahead. A year's view of the contracts, and especially major contracts, right? We should have that information. Thank you, Scott, for making me clarify that. And what else? I think that's all I have for right now. Other than our one more question I do have is about the subcategories. Are they all included in here as well in these graphs? Like any subcontract or sub-agreements?
They would be included, yes, in the professional consulting services.
Okay.
Yeah,
So they're also in there?
that's right.
And again, it would be good to see some major ones that are included in here. All right, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. I'll be brief. My comments are really just about the equity opportunities here. So I really appreciate slide 18, coming public. Yeah, we've looked at this for a little bit internally, and I understand that enrollment is the largest reason for which the budgets have been declining. And I'm also hopeful about some district-covered positions that might be restored that we've talked about in our last board meeting together. And I'm encouraged about a history of potentially second allocations going out to schools as we've, gotten more information from the state or additional dollars. So my comment really is just to the team, as we do get these choices in front of us, whether it's restored positions or additional money from the state, that we keep a keen eye on equity, and we focus on these high and highest need schools that have been destabilized for far too long, and we want to make sure we're doing everything possible to protect the kids that most need the system to work for them. So really just a comment on equity for that piece there. And then just a connection back to a resolution we passed on budget transparency. As we're developing these tools, I would just encourage the team to add them to our budget transparency tool that's online. I think that would have helped as well with Board Member Gomez's resolution around doing this equity analysis. To whatever extent we can make this easily accessible. I know you all are receiving information from the public who are beta users on the budget transparency tool right now. And we've previewed it with our Family Advisory Council, and folks really do want information like this, and they want to help lift lift up their voices. I know we hear from the PAC and the CAC really often that they want to make sure they're giving us input, right? Not just getting information and learning about things, but helping us as we get into some tough budget decisions. And then my last comment really, for my colleagues here, we are making big decisions on almost 90% of the budget as we come up against some labor contracts. And so I appreciate the conversation on professional services contracts, but I hope we have, as keen of an eye on our big labor contracts for the 90% that the budget really does go to, because we should similarly have a very fine comb for how our values are showing up through labor, which I hope we can settle soon. We are all looking forward to agreements with our labor partners. So thank you for a few moments.
You. So is that questions? No more questions from anyone? Okay, great, wonderful. Well, thank you, Mr. Bravo Karimi, for answering all of our questions. And I know there's several follow-ups, so if you can get that information to us, that would be great.
Thanks.